I ought to begin by apologising for the rather distracting background to this picture. Frankly, if I turned the camera in any other direction, the distraction and chaos would be even worse, so you're getting off fairly lightly. In some ways, it's a picture of our life at the moment. Lives live with a background of distraction and chaos. Incidentally, I'm Rod Jones, a retired parish priest, retiring 7 years ago from being parish priest at St Mary Horsell on the edge of Woking. And my wife and I have visited you on a number of occasions and have always found it a happy occasion and realise you're a much loved and cared for church. Well, I don't know if you agree, but the last week the mood of the nation has darkened somewhat. 5 scientists were asked during the week in a major newspaper to give their predictions about the immediate future, and most of them were pretty pessimistic, although they all pinned their hopes on the vaccinations that are coming. In fact, if there was a popular hymn at the moment, it would probably be, "All my hope on AstraZeneca is founded, it doth still my trust renew." But then we suspect that the vaccine is going to be much slower getting into the arms of the nation than politicians have soothingly promised. It reminds me a little bit of a picture in P.G. Wodehouse where he talks about light at the end of a tunnel, which turns out to be the headlights of the 8:15 express from Paddington. Now, I used to think of professors as rather rare and ancient beasts, but in the past year we've heard the views of scores and scores of fresh-faced professors of this field of knowledge and that. But in the end, despite the brilliance of scientists, much of it seems to have turned out as being highly educated guesswork and leaves us and our leaders fumbling our way forward, trying to keep the car from going off the road as we grapple with the wayward steering wheel. What are we to make of such turmoil? What are we as Christians to make of the turmoil of our time? Now, I have no more wisdom than anyone else about the deeper whys and whats that we're all going through. But even given our comparative ignorance, our impotence, our anxiety, is there a word, a gospel word, which takes with utter seriousness our predicament, and yet offers not a way out, but a way through it? Listen again to a couple of difficult verses from the Epistle to the Hebrews, chapter 12. His, that is God's voice, then shook the earth. But now he has promised, "Yet once more I will shake not only the earth, but also the heavens." The phrase "yet once more" indicates the removal of what is shaken, in order that what cannot be shaken may remain. Now, it's a complex verse, but I guess I read into it. Essentially, it's talking about God shaking the earth and the heavens, and it refers to the lasting significance of what is left after the shaking has stopped. Perhaps this verse gives us a hint of a God's eye view of these tumultuous, earth-shaking times. The verse suggests perhaps a Christian perspective on history, and perhaps on our present crisis in particular. First, we ought to accept that what can be shaken perhaps ought to be shaken. The events of the past year have shaken up so many areas of our life, of working practices, job security, travel patterns, economic, education, family life have been stress tested to their limits. Lockdowns have put many families under intolerable financial, childcare and relationship strains. The inequalities in the education system and the gaps between the rich and the poor have widened in this pandemic. So much that needed to be shaken up has been shaken up, and so it has presented us with the challenge and opportunity hereafter to change things for the better. The ground violently shaking beneath our feet may have forced change that comfortable normality would otherwise have left untouched. One example may be that the cause of slowing global warming has been indirectly helped by the pandemic. We've been forced to rethink our transport needs, undertaken fewer air flights and car journeys, and so reduce our CO2 emissions. The skies have been more clear and vibrant, the traffic fumes reduced, and we've become more aware of birdsong. The same might well be true for our church life. The pandemic and regulations have forced us to adjust to new patterns and ways of worshipping together, just as we are now. The church in our land has undergone a testing time, and the shaking has made us face difficult questions earlier than we might have liked. This is a painful thing, but facing up to reality is surely in the end a healthy thing. God meets us in the reality, not in the fantasy. Also, has our personal faith been shaken in the pandemic? Taking a red-hot coal out of a fire and setting it aside, isolating it on the hearth, and it will soon grow cold. Well, isolation from God's people physically can easily do the same to our personal faith. We are a people. We need each other as we recite the creed and sing hymns and greet each other in the peace. The shaking of the earth and the heavens tests structures, reveals what is second-rate, tawdry, unworthy, unfit material for God's project of bringing about a new heaven and a new earth, which includes the well-being of humanity and the witness of God's people. So we should accept that what can be shaken perhaps ought to be shaken. But secondly, our verse from Hebrews suggests that beneath the results of our willful choices, we should be ready to recognize that it's God at work in the shaking. This is a central theme of the Old Testament, which Jesus reflects in some of his parables about the kingdom of heaven. It's the idea of the dynamic God who is not only sovereign over history, but actively at work in it, using who and what he will to accomplish his purposes. We see it clearly in the Exodus stories of the calling of Moses, of God's people, leaving the secure slavery in Pharaoh's kingdom into the deadly freedom of the uncharted desert. And wherever they got off course, God hauled them back with utter ruthlessness, not balking, if the prophets are to be believed, at using war, captivity, pestilence, and desolation as his instruments. We should be open to recognize it may be God shaking our structures, ecclesiastical, political, and economic, when they become rigid, unhealthy, or unjust. And in the shaking, God often seems to use a motley crew of collaborators, reformers, mystics, militants, atheists, and agnostics. If God used the Persian king Cyrus over 2,000 years BC, or rather 1,000 years BC, as the rod of his triumph, of his anger, maybe even Vladimir Putin, President Xi of China, and even Donald Trump may have some part to play in the providence of God, even if they offer lessons about how not to wield power justly. So what can be shaken ought to be shaken, and be ready to recognize that God is at work in the shaking. But finally, in this time of turmoil, we need to cling to the things that remain, despite and after all the shaking. We need to learn to treasure two great affirmations in the New Testament, which point us in a time of turmoil to things which cannot be shaken. The first is the consistent nature of God. Paul wrote to young Timothy, God abides faithful. He cannot deny himself. God's faithfulness is a great conviction that the people of the Old Testament have passed on to us. At the time of the ancient peoples, they were enthralled to gods noted for their capriciousness, gods who at a whim blessed their devotees with a bountiful harvest or petulantly blasted them with thunderbolts. Whereas the Jews clung tenaciously to their belief in the moral consistency of God. Remember Abraham pleading for the lives of the inhabitants of Sodom, whom God had resolved to destroy because of their wickedness. Modestly and persistently, the old patriarch got God to reduce his terms for a reprieve. Remember, he said, well, supposing there are 50 righteous in the day, and then he got it down to 40, and then to 10. Then Abraham made his final appeal with an unanswerable argument. Shall not the judge of all the earth do right? Abraham cries. He's almost saying, Lord, there are certain things that not even you can do because they would violate your nature. Through good days and ill, the Jews discover that God could be trusted to maintain the stability of the natural order, of seed time and harvest, sunrise and sunset, and most important of all, trusted to redeem his promises expressed in a covenant relationship which he has never broken from his side. From Abraham to Paul, from Paul to Timothy, from the early church to this very day, countless thousands have put their trust in the consistent nature of God and have not been proved wrong. When the American preacher and novelist Lloyd C. Douglas, the man who wrote the book The Robe, made into a big film years ago, when he was a student, he had digs in a big house on the ground floor of which lived an old music teacher who was housebound through his infirmity. Douglas would visit him every day, popping his head around the door and asking him the same ritual question. Well, what's the good news today? And the man would give the same ritual answer. The old man would pick up a tuning fork and strike it on the table. Hear that? It's middle C. It's middle C today. It was middle C yesterday and the day before. It will be middle C tomorrow and the day after and for 1,000 years to come. The tenor across the hall sings flat and the piano upstairs is out of tune. Noise, noise all around me, but that, my friend, is middle C. Middle C, a constant in the midst of turmoil and dissonance. Consistency at the heart of the universe. The author of the Epistle to the Hebrews, writing in the midst of war and revolution, personalized this truth. He made a great leap of understanding when he cried, Jesus Christ, the same today, yesterday, and forever. That is the note to strike when all around us is out of tune. And after holding on to the faithful consistency of God, finally a second affirmation is about how a Christian walks through life. Paul assured the Corinthian church that when all else passes away, faith, hope, and love will abide, these three. Faith, hope, and love. When the shaking stops, these three will prove to be unshakable. These are not random virtues practiced by Christians. They are the essential dimensions of the Christian life, which is defective if we neglect any of the three. Hope is not just another name for cheery optimism. Optimism is basically about rosy prospects. I dare to disagree with that theological statement by Julie Andrews in The Sound of Music, when she's saying, I have confidence in confidence alone. No, Christian hope is not the same as optimism, hoping for the best. Real Christian hope is God's reality, about what is real to God, about what God is doing, what God has promised, what God will do. Christian hope is trusting God for the future in the light of Jesus. Faith is about trusting, often in the face of appearances and contrary to what our eyes seem to tell us. Christian hope is possible because the one who follows the way of Christ has faith that there is no human situation, however unpromising, which is beyond the reach of his love. So, as we day by day walk faithfully, hopefully into this new year, let's perhaps hear the words of St. Augustine, which my wife put onto a sampler. Entrust the past to the mercy of God, the present to his love, and the future to his providence. So let us now enjoy and attend to the words and music of our next hymn.